We're going to shift gears now for our third keynote presentation of the day, Karl Marx, A Ghost in the American Machine. Our presenter, Andrew Hartman, is professor of history at Illinois State University. He was also the founding president of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History, and he remains a regular contributor to the Society's award-winning blog. Professor Hartman has published 2 books. The first, Education in the Cold War, The Battle for the American School, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2008. And the second, A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015. Professor Hartman was also named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians in 2015. Please help me welcome Andrew.
Well, thank you to Scott for the great introduction, to Gleaves Whitney and the Hauenstein Center, especially for inviting me to give a lecture on Karl Marx on the occasion of his 199th birthday today. I'm sure that was planned. Okay, so this is going to be a little different than everything we've talked about so far today. In the early years of radio, the BBC aired a famous series about exiles in London. I should say famous exiles in London. One such episode included an interview with an elderly man who had long been retired from his job in the British Museum's reading room. The man was asked if he remembered a patron by the name of Karl Marx, who for many years toiled at the museum on what would become his masterpiece, Das Kapital. At first, the retired museum worker drew a blank, but after he had been given several clues, Marx sat in the same seat every day. He wore a thick, graying beard. He endured painful boils. And he endlessly requested materials about political economy. Well, then, after that, the man's memory came alive. Oh, Mr. Marx, yes, to be sure. He gave us a lot of work, he did, with all his calls for books and papers. And then one day, he just stopped coming. And you know what's a funny thing, sir? Nobody's ever heard of him since. Marx himself half expected capital to tumble into oblivion. As he was preparing to send it to press in 1867, he suggested that his longtime friend and collaborator, Frederick Engels, read The Unknown Masterpiece by Balzac. This was a sardonic recommendation. The Unknown Masterpiece was a story about a painter who spent decades laboring on a single painting in an effort to render a perfectly accurate representation of reality. When a fellow artist looked at it and scorned the piece as unintelligible, the painter hastily destroyed it in a blaze of fire and died soon after. The 20th century American philosopher Marshall Berman submitted that there was irony in Marx's dark analogy. Just as the painter's aborted attempt at realism anticipated the abstract expressionism of modern art, Marx's complex and often disjointed attempt to unmask the logic of capitalism was more befitting later times. In Berman's words, where one age sees only chaos and incoherence, a later or more modern age may discover meaning and beauty. So despite Marx's cautious expectations, his masterpiece was, as you know, not doomed to oblivion. Capital unfolded the workings of capitalism in such profound fashion that people across the planet have been reading with it or grappling with it ever since at least the Gilded Age, a time when Marx's theory that capitalism was a system that pitted capital against labor seemed to have revealed itself as the truth. Marx's fate in this way has been tied to the fate of capitalism. To read Marx is to wrestle with the modern world that capitalism has made. This includes modern America, especially modern America. Now, I realize saying as much as is akin to a heresy, Americans, by and large, have never truly welcomed Marx's ideas. But today I'm going to make the case that Marx is a ghost in the American machine, a veritable American alter ego. Historians have long highlighted the imprint of Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith, John Locke, Tom Paine, the list goes on, the impact that they made on America and American culture. But because Marx pointed to our modern capitalist society and world in ways that none of these other thinkers did, because he gave us provocative and often, for many, convincing ways to think about capitalism, his stamp might be more pronounced than the rest. Marx himself sought to ensure his own reception in America, especially during the Civil War when he wrote numerous articles supporting the Union. And he even wrote a famous letter to President Lincoln. So beginning my narrative by putting Marx into conversation with Lincoln is perhaps a curious choice, given their stark differences. Lincoln championed the free labor system that was under development across the northern and northwest United States. Marx equated free labor with wage slavery because workers had no choice but to sell their labor in order to survive. And yet, both men had an intense hatred for chattel slavery, and during the Civil War, Marx became one of Europe's most influential supporters of Lincoln's cause. At the outset of the war, European radicals were hesitant to criticize the rebellious southern states on the grounds that they believed in national self-determination, but probably more to the point because they were confused about the cause for Southern secession, the reasons for it. But Marx convinced many of them that the Civil War was explicitly about slavery, and that defending or defeating the Confederacy would be a blow to transatlantic slavery, and thus an important step towards working class emancipation. Union victory, he argued, would create conditions more favorable to organizing the working class, since a free labor system would no longer need to compete with a slave one. It was through this lens that Marx viewed Lincoln. As he wrote in a letter to Lincoln on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, more famously known as the First International, that he helped found, the working men of Europe consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of the social world. So the Civil War helped shape Marx's thought, and vice versa, Marx's thought had an impact in the United States. Marx is written into America and America into Marx in ways that we fail to appreciate. So before Marx died in 1883, an intrepid, and as his fame gained, an intrepid few American reporters traveled to London to interview him. One set a dramatic scene. Yes, I am tête-à-tête with the revolution incarnate, with the real founder and guiding spirit of the International Society, with the author of the address in which capital was told that if it warred on labor, it must expect to have its house burned down around its ears. In a word, with the apologist of the Commune of Paris. So during Marx's lifetime, he had already become a set piece in the dramatic narrative that Americans told themselves about their place in relation to the furious rise of industrial capitalism. Simply put, Marx represented the drama of modern history with a capital H. Take, for example, the crisis-gripped 1930s, when Marx came to be seen as a prophet for having theorized capitalism's inevitable demise, and when capital H history invaded the lives and minds of millions of Americans. This was particularly true of people who were engaged in Marxist movements during the 1930s. As Vivian Gornick writes in The Romance of American Communism, these were Americans whose lives were formed by political history, as were no other American lives save those of the original revolutionists. History is in them, and they are in history. Given the high political drama of the 1930s, it's not surprising that some of the most original works of American political thought and history emerged from that decade. Nor is it surprising, I would submit, that some of it was heavily influenced by Marx. To illustrate, what I want to do now is offer a close reading of two of the greatest history books, in my humble opinion, that have ever been written. W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, which was published in 1935, and C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, which was published a few years later in 1938. Both books were about race, class, slavery, capitalism, and revolution, and both were forged with comparable purposes in mind. Du Bois and James sought that their historical insights about revolutions past would speak to revolution's future. Moreover, both books are landmarks of historical scholarship precisely for their Marxism. But on the flip side, Du Bois and James expanded upon Marx in ways that gave readers a new and better understanding of capitalism, one that more fully accounted for the plunders of slavery, colonialism, and genocide, or what Marx called primitive accumulation. So this is a crucial and particularly American contribution to enlarging the ways in which people came to understand Marx, Marxism, and capitalism. Du Bois and James personified what the late political theorist Cedric Robinson called Black Marxism in an important 1983 book of that title. So Black Marxism, which was hugely influential, I can't understate that enough, it made two major arguments. First, Cedric Robinson isolated a Black radical tradition that was distinct from Marxism and grounded in African or syncretic cultural forms. Second, he located something that he called racial capitalism. Simply put, the history of capitalism cannot possibly be understood apart from the history of racism, slavery, imperialism, genocide. Capital accumulation was dependent on the enslavement and murder of millions of people of color. According to Robinson, Marx largely ignored racial capitalism, or at least explained away aspects of it like slavery as sort of the remains or vestiges of a feudal order, because such notions did not fit with his ideas about how capitalism was in the process of producing its own gravediggers. So in other words, for Marx, revolution would happen in the advanced nations of Europe because it was there that capitalism had developed an industrial working class that was ready to throw off its chains. But for Robinson, this was a view of capitalism limited by Marx's provincial focus on Europe proper. For a more encompassing analysis, Marx, according to Robinson, should have focused more on European empire, especially in the Americas. So it's certainly true that the 1848 Communist Manifesto focused on capitalism as a system that was upending European feudalism, even as it hinted at globalization. But much of Marx's later writings extended his analysis beyond Europe. In Capital, Marx wrote the following, and I quote, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins, are all things which characterize the dawn of an era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation." Thus, maybe this is a counter to Robinson's argument. Perhaps Marx anticipated this notion of racial capitalism. But elsewhere in Capital, Marx treated slavery as an analogy for relations of production that truly mattered most to him in his analysis, between implicitly European factory workers and implicitly European factory owners. Moreover, Marx argued that as capitalism expanded its reach beyond the globe, it would render slavery and other forms of what he called primitive accumulation to the dustbins of history. So capitalism for Marx was both progressive and horrible, And this paradox is evident in Marx's writings about the American Civil War. The Union, the United States, represented the forces of capitalism, and in this Marx focused on the progressive side of capitalism because the Union was in the process of destroying slavery. Not only bad at a moral level, slavery was also bad because it slowed the expansion of a capitalist labor system and thus the development of revolutionary socialist consciousness. In other words, Robinson was correct about Marx's rather limited view of capitalism, since he did not account for the role of black slaves who were soon to be free. So Marx, in other words, left a lot open to interpretation. It's into this void that Du Bois came. W.E.B. Du Bois, as many of you might know, is best known as one of the founders of the NAACP, and he's most famous as the author of the 1903 magisterial book, The Souls of Black Folk, which forwarded his famous theory about a talented tenth who would lead blacks to equality. But Du Bois is less famous as one of the most innovative thinkers or readers of Karl Marx in American history. His book, Black Reconstruction, built on Marx's argument that the Civil War was a revolutionary opening. The war was a proletarian revolution within a bourgeois republic. But to this, Du Bois added an important revision. As opposed to the white working class of the more orthodox Marxist imagination, black slaves represented the proletariat. Du Bois labeled black resistance during the Civil War a general strike. By resisting work on Confederate plantations and by swamping approaching Union lines, slaves helped win the Civil War and in the process emancipated themselves. In the words of Du Bois, this was one of the most extraordinary experiments of Marxism that the world before the Russian Revolution had ever seen. But in his analysis, the class struggle went both ways. Building on his interpretation of the Civil War, Du Bois showed that the Reconstruction that followed was America's unfinished revolution. When black labor came under white control once again, so when the Union, or I should say the American armies, deserted the South in 1877, the revolution was smashed. Reconstruction was ended because a national elite determined that it needed a chastened black labor force. And it discovered that it could turn the Southern white working class against blacks to keep them in their proverbial chains. In sum, the fact that Du Bois conceptualized black Reconstruction through a Marxist framework was more than merely incidental. His use of Marx was highly constructive. So what should we then make of Robinson's argument that Du Bois not only revised Marx, but more than that, he turned against the Marxist tradition in favor of the black radical tradition? So on the first half of this equation, when it comes to racial components of capitalism, Du Bois was straightforward. In the first few pages of Black Reconstruction, he wrote, "Black labor became the foundation not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. New cities were built on the results of black labor, and a new labor problem involving all white labor arose both in Europe and in America." But more than that, more than merely advancing a notion of racial capitalism, Robinson argued that Du Bois had, at long last, found his way to the black radical tradition. And so this is grounded in this black power notion that black thought is separate from white thought, including Marxist thought. Robinson highlighted Du Bois's contention that the black slave result was predicated on religious fervor rather than class consciousness. "This was the coming of the Lord," Du Bois wrote. "This was the fulfillment of prophecy and legend. It was the golden dawn after chains of 1,000 years." So it turns out that what Du Bois called one of the most extraordinary experiments of Marxism was founded on a culture of religious belief that had roots in Africa. So in Robinson's rather creative reading, this was evidence that Du Bois had unshackled himself from Marxism. Robinson interpreted CLR James in similarly imaginative fashion. So James hailed from Trinidad and spent much of the 1930s living in Britain, but he moved to the United States in 1938 and lived there until he was deported for alleged subversion in 1953. For most of his time in the United States, he was active in the Trotskyist movement. More on that in a bit. Perhaps because of this, the Black Jacobins is arguably even more explicitly Marxist and revolutionary than Black Reconstruction. It reads like a drama in the tragic sense of that word. In this way, the Black Jacobins might be more Shakespeare than Marx. James's narration of Toussaint L'Ouverture's rise and fall is a strategy. It's a tragedy in the dramatic sense of that word. But one of the appeals of Marx to many, especially in the 20th century, especially in the 1930s, was the way in which his theory of class struggle captured the drama of history with a capital H. Marx's theory of history also influenced people as a compelling way to think about the interplay of events and people. So in the Black Jacobins, James toggled between competing assumptions about events determining humans and vice versa, humans determining events. For him, Toussaint was a great man, really in the Whig history sense. Born a slave, he made himself into arguably the greatest revolutionary in the age of revolutions. And yet, as James wrote, Toussaint did not make the revolution, it was the revolution that made Toussaint. Did a Marxist emphasis on larger social relations then spoil the fun of his Whiggish romanticism? Perhaps, or perhaps not. James followed the line about revolutions making Toussaint with a curious qualifier, and even that is not the whole truth. Even that is not the whole truth. So in retrospect, it seems James's uncertainty about causality was his way of sort of going back and forth between Marxism and the Black radical tradition. He really, it seems, couldn't make up his mind. Whereas the Marxist tradition is deeply historicist when it's not sort of teleological, the Black radical tradition is trans-historical. Slaves in this tradition became revolutionaries by channeling African ancestors who were radicalized by their very first encounter with slave trading Europeans. It's sort of a theory of original sin. Despite such hesitations, when describing his theory of history in the Black Jacobins, James stayed very close to the Marxist approach. He wrote, "Great men make history, but only such history as it is possible for them to make. Their freedom of achievement is limited by the necessities of their environment." If this sounds familiar, it's because in Marx's most famous essay in which he explores his theory of history, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx wrote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances already existing, given and transmitted from the past." So James, in his analysis of the Haitian Revolution, focused on the ways in which larger forces created the conditions for such a revolution. He wrote, "The slaves worked on the land, and like revolutionary peasants everywhere, they aimed at the extermination of their oppressors. But working and living together in gangs of hundreds on huge sugar factories, they were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time. And the rising or the uprising was therefore a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement." Nonetheless, James makes clear that conditions for revolution were not always present. In the same way that Du Bois showed that the Civil War made a general strike among slaves possible, James showed that the French Revolution made the San Domingo Revolution possible. It not only created chaos that served as an opening for the slaves, but it also generated an ethos of liberty that found its way across the Atlantic. If the French masses could overthrow their venal monarchy, then surely the slaves could overthrow their debauched planter class. Quote, "Revolution," says Karl Marx, "is the locomotive of history. Here was a locomotive that had traveled at remarkable speed." In this, James made what has since become a standard cause and effect argument about the Haitian Revolution. But his analytical work here was hardly finished. James made clear that the connective tissue between home country, France, and empire was not one-directional. He argued that the slave trade and slavery were the economic basis of the French Revolution. As French merchants grew rich from the slave trade and associated industries, they asserted their newfound confidence relative to the aristocracy, which precipitated a revolution that eventually spread to the French masses and to the San Domingo slaves. So this was an irony of history. But just as Du Bois showed that the Civil War was not the end of class struggle, not the final victory, James demonstrated the same with regards to the French Revolution and the slave uprising. The French bourgeoisie ultimately conquered the democratic masses in France and sought to do the same with their former slaves in San Domingo. So Toussaint's hopes that San Domingo would be a crucial component of a Republican France were smashed, as he withered to his death in a French prison on the orders of Napoleon. A war for Haitian independence morphed into a racial war of annihilation. In the Black radical tradition, one would think that this was a necessary, if not precisely a happy outcome. But to James, this was a tragedy. Toussaint's dream of an interracial and Republican San Domingo was crushed. In the end, according to James, Toussaint failed because his idea of revolution was too European. James argued that capitalism had made the black slave a revolutionary, just as it had made the European industrial worker a revolutionary, but that whereas the industrial worker's culture was shot through with European and sort of bourgeois norms, the revolutionary slave's culture grew out of African roots. And here he was talking about Haitian voodoo, which was a thoroughly anti-bourgeois and anti-European revolutionary culture. The Haitian Revolution could not be reconciled with the French Republic, and according to Robinson, this argument put James into the camp of the Black radical tradition. Robinson was highly invested of separating these Black intellectuals from the Marxist tradition. Robinson wrote, quote, "This was a complete departure from the way in which Marx had conceptualized the transformative and rationalizing significance of the bourgeoisie. It implied, and James did not see this, that bourgeois culture and thought and ideology were irrelevant to the development of revolutionary consciousness among Black peoples." So although I agree with Robinson that Du Bois and James expanded on Marx in important ways, Robinson was too eager to separate them from Marx. Du Bois and James would not have reached their conclusions, would not have written their masterpieces, if they had not been so focused on Marx. Marx helped them grapple with modern history. But in turn, their position as Americans at the margins I'm defining Americans at the margins very broadly. It allowed them to open Marx up to exciting new avenues of understanding the dramatic unfolding of modern history with a capital H. And so here I'm going to sort of change course a little bit, because although to U.S. historians extremely grounded in the historiography of the Civil War and slavery, the influence of Du Bois and James is undeniable, and so thus Marx is written into America through historiography. To those less familiar with that, you might need a more sort of compelling example, and so that's what I'm going to work with now. So Du Bois and James had something in common with those white ethnics in the 1930s who saw no contradiction between Marx and the America that they hoped to create, they hoped to achieve. So that's the group I'm going to turn to now, and here I'm talking about the famous New York intellectuals who came of age in this very same 1930s, fighting the sectarian left battles that honed their skills in Marxist polemics. As many of these intellectuals later became Cold War liberals and even conservatives, They held on to their combative spirits, their fondness for sweeping declarations, and their suspicion of dogma. Moreover, long after they had rejected Marxism, they maintained, I argue, their Marxist tendency for diagnosing problems in relation to root causes, internal logics, and overarching structures. They espoused a universal understanding of the world and believed that any problem, no matter how seemingly provincial, could and should be related to larger forces. So try as they might, they could not escape the grip of Marx. And thus, I would argue, our very understanding of America as it developed across the Cold War was underwritten by Marx, which speaks to the influence of many of these New York intellectuals. So let me give you what I think is the compelling example of James Burnham, whose experience with Marx in the dramatic 1930s forever marked his intellectual armature, even as he became a conservative in the 1950s. Burnham was a key thinker among the 1930s anti-Stalinist left. Yet in 1955, he helped William Buckley Jr. found the National Review. So how do we explain this intellectual U-turn, and how does it help us understand Marx in America? Unlike most in this milieu, Burnham was born into relative comfort. After an elite education at all levels, he took a position in 1929 in the New York University Philosophy Department. There he hoped to cultivate his budding talents in literature and criticism. But like so many people of this generation, the Great Depression wreaked havoc on Burnham's worldview. By 1930, he had begun reading Marx voraciously. Burnham's fellow NYU philosopher, Sidney Hook, is a key figure in pushing Burnham to the left and in pushing Burnham to Marx. In 1932, Burnham published a long essay by Hook in a journal that Burnham edited. This essay later grew into Hook's first big book, Towards the Understanding of Karl Marx, which a reviewer at the time called the most significant contribution to Marxism which has appeared as yet in America. In this essay and in the book, Hook wrote, quote, "The world today stands in the shadow of a man not yet dead 50 years. The doctrines of Karl Marx, comparatively unknown and ignored in his own lifetime, exercise a stronger influence upon the present age than the social theories of any of our contemporaries. History is being made in their name." This isn't the greatest image, but this is an image of Hook with his teacher, the philosopher John Dewey. In Hook's reading of Marx, he melded pragmatism, which of course is the quintessentially, I would argue, American philosophy of his teacher, John Dewey, to Marx's theory of capitalism. If the Great Depression signaled the death knell of capitalism, as it seemed to for many people, Americans should turn to Marx in their efforts to create a better tomorrow. But, and this was the Deweyan spin on this Hook theory, only to the degree that Marx's ideas worked in the context of the American spirit, the American experiment. So fellow New York intellectual and sort of mover in the Trotskyist world in the 1930s, Max Eastman, he endowed Toward the Understanding of Karl Marx with the great mocking subtitle, Sidney Hook's Daydream of What Marx Might Have Said Had He Been a Pupil of John Dewey. So despite Hook's influence, it was ultimately Leon Trotsky who converted Burnham to the cause. Burnham never quit, I would argue, maybe this is going to be controversial, but he never quit emulating Trotsky's style of Marxist analysis, which he first discovered when reading Trotsky's 1932 book, translated into English by Eastman, titled The History of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky's philosophical system, of course, was called dialectical materialism, which was a Soviet-inflected offshoot of Marxism, in which it was theorized that historical patterns gave rise to contradictions that then gave rise to new patterns. Or to put this in more Marxist terms, class domination gave rise to class struggle, which then gave rise to new social relations, ideally socialism. So this was a philosophical system of imposing order on a chaotic world, and this system granted Burnham the confidence to understand, explain, and often predict, wrongly, political developments across the world. From 1933 to 1939, Burnham was an active and respected member of the Trotskyist movement that sought to build and establish an anti-Stalinist left in the United States. But in 1940, he left the movement and declared he was no longer a Marxist. So what happened? There are a lot of different stories that go into this conversion because a lot of people made this conversion in this time period. For Burnham, it seems to have been that he thought his way out of Marxism using the habits of mind that he had picked up in becoming a Marxist. One of the most important debates of the sectarian left of the 1930s revolved around the following questions. Was Stalinism a deformation of the Russian Revolution? Was it a betrayal of Marx? Or was Stalinism the logical conclusion of Bolshevism, also the logical conclusion of Marx and Marxism? So Trotsky declared that Stalinism was the result of conservative, or what he would have said, bourgeois elements that had gained centralized authority within the Workers' Republic of the Soviet Union. But even granting such degeneration, as it was called, the Soviet Union for Trotsky remained a workers' nation and thus demanded the support against the capitalist imperialist powers. So Trotsky and his acolytes stuck to this, what I would say was a rather contorted position, even after the Stalin-Hitler Pact, and even after the Soviet Union occupied chunks of Eastern Europe in 1939 and Finland in 1940. In contrast, Burnham argued that the Soviet Union was barely different in form from the other imperialist powers of that age, and here he singled out not only Nazi Germany, but the United States. All three of these powerful nations represented to him a new repressive form of political power. It was post-capitalist, but it was certainly not socialist, and he called this bureaucratic collectivism. So breaking with Trotsky at the analytical level meant that he was going to have to break with Trotsky politically. There was no other way around that with Trotsky. And I think at first it was painful, but I also think that Burnham came to accept that. He was okay with that. So by 1940, Burnham not only quit the movement, but quit Marxism itself in a public declaration to the Trotskyist movement. He declared that he had been seduced by a philosophy, dialectical materialism, which he said was only merely based on a set of flimsy metaphors. It had become clear to Burnham that this dialectic, which predicted socialism was coming, was a lousy way to think about the United States, where capitalism, it seemed to have stabilized by the 1930s. Trotsky responded to Burnham in characteristic fashion. Quote, Burnham does not recognize the dialectic, but the dialectic recognizes Burnham. So not to be outdone, Burnham responded in kind, quote, Comrade Trotsky, I will not match metaphors with you. In such a verbal tournament, I concede you the ribbon in advance. Evidence, argument, proof, these are my only weapons. So Burnham was done with Marx, so he says, but I would argue that Marx was not done with Burnham. While rethinking his Marxist commitments, Burnham wrote his most famous book, The Managerial Revolution, which the late historian Jack Diggins described as an answer to Trotskyism and a farewell to Marxism, as a philosophy of history and as a program of hope, but not as a mode of analysis. The Managerial Revolution elaborated on Burnham's theory about bureaucratic collectivism. The economic means of production were now controlled by a technocratic elite headed up by world leaders such as Stalin, Hitler, and FDR. So Marx was wrong about the future. Socialism was not the next step in the dialectic. But Marx's notion of power was right in that who controlled the means of production controlled politics and controlled society. So Burnham continued to follow Marx in seeing, I guess you could say, through the sham of liberal sentimental principles like democracy and justice. Power was all that mattered. This analysis is what led C. Wright Mills to later name Burnham the Marx of the managers. So Burnham had given up on Marx's socialist revolution, but had retained Marx's skepticism of liberal pieties. From there, the path to conservatism was short and direct. But even as a conservative, Burnham clung to the Marxist tendency of imposing conceptual order on seemingly distinct entities. In his best-known book in his conservative phase, Suicide of the West, which was published in 1964, Burnham identified a series of beliefs that he categorized as belonging to liberalism, and he at this time considered liberalism an ideological syndrome. This was an explanation that attached sort of disparate parts to a logical whole, a series of seemingly distinct liberal ideas. For example, human nature is malleable. Change is good. Tradition, bad. Ignorance is a product of social context. Education can overcome ignorance. These beliefs for Burnham were manifestations of a larger coherent system that he was naming and describing as liberalism. So loath as Burnham would have been to admit it, such thinking as sort of laid out in this whole book, I would argue, resembles a Marxist dialectic. Western civilization expanded along Christian ideals, but out of such ideals arose a contradiction, liberalism, which was ultimately proving responsible for the death of the West by suicide. So upon awarding Burnham the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1983, President Reagan remarked that Burnham was one of those principally responsible for the great intellectual odyssey of our century, the journey away from totalitarian statism and toward the uplifting doctrines of freedom. So agree or disagree with this characterization of Burnham's intellectual trajectory, more interesting to me is that a deep engagement with Marx permanently shaded and shaped one of the most important conservatives in 20th century American intellectual history. So it's worth pondering the implications of this. I think it's worth pondering Marx in America, even and especially when such a combination seems a contradiction in terms. So to conclude my talk today, I would say that the degree to which Americans openly recognized and have recognized Marx as a figure worth grappling with, and in the ways in which they grapple with him, has shifted across historical context. This is to be expected, of course. When the American left reemerged in the 1960s as a surprisingly vital force, Marx was among its symbols of grassroots rebellion, just like in the 1930s. But in the 60s, in the age of affluence, unlike in the 1930s, in the age of the Great Depression, Marx meant something vastly different. In the context of the financial crash of 2008 and the ensuing sort of maybe green shoots of a radical awakening that is manifested in Occupy Wall Street, or the surprisingly successful presidential campaign of an avowed socialist, Bernie Sanders, self-described, I would call him a New Deal Democrat, Americans have begun reading and writing about Marx at levels perhaps not seen since the 1960s, or maybe even the crisis-gripped 1930s. Perhaps the election of Trump serves as an important counter-narrative to any just so story about Marx coming back into fashion. Maybe this is a warning, much ado about nothing. But I would argue that Trump, above everything else, represents the return of history with a capital H. And as I have attempted to argue today in my lecture, Marx speaks well to history with a capital H. So thank you very much. I told you it'd be different.
I'd like to ask you two questions about James Burnham.
Only two?
Only two.
Okay.
And hopefully they'll coincide. You'd mentioned the Suicide of the West and the sort of phantom of the dialectic within it, but Suicide of the West was also very much influenced by Arnold Toynbee. And the title of the work itself is somewhat derived from Toynbee. And the idea of challenge and response, of course, which is somewhat related to the dialectic, is core to Toynbee himself. So I'm wondering perhaps if there's a Marx-Toynbee connection that can also be teased out. And then the other question I have is, in addition to Burnham's modifications of Marxism in The Managerial Revolution, he then publishes another book, The Machiavellians, which I've sort of, I'm struck in The Machiavellians. He draws not only upon Machiavelli, but also upon Vilfredo Pareto, George Sorel, Gaetano Mosca, etc. But it seems to me that Marx haunts the Machiavellians as well, and that this attempt to derive a kind of sociology of power with no mention to Marx, in fact, is using sociologists who themselves had read Marx very closely and who had derived some of their ideas from Marx, even if they had a very non-Marxian direction. So I just wanted to ask about this larger intellectual sort of framework and set of connections.
Well, great questions, and you can expect that I'll ask the favor of you, and when this chapter is ready, I'm going to send it your way. Because just to give you a little background information, I sort of put out a call for, when I was preparing this talk, so I'm writing a book on Karl Marx in America, and I'm knee-deep in my research in sort of like the late 19th century, and I've done a bunch of research on sort of black Marxism as I presented here, but I wanted to do something sort of about a conservative as well today, and so I've been voraciously reading James Burnham and all about Burnham in the last 2 weeks. Many of these reading suggestions came from you, Dan, so thank you very much for that. And I would just sort of say, yes, and one of the problems that I'm finding, it's an exciting problem, but one of the problems I'm finding with thinking about the reception of Marx in America in the modern sort of intellectual history of the 20th century is that you can almost see him everywhere, but when you see him everywhere doesn't mean that he's nowhere as well, and that is that a Marxist style of thought had become so central to modern thinking and modern ways of sort of organizing society in our minds in the 20th century, that it's hard to say, well, this is specifically influenced by Marx. So that's one of my challenges, and I think that gets at, like, is he influenced by Toynbee? Is he influenced by Marx? And so I see this sort of a difficult thing to disentangle. And the Machiavellians, I just started reading that, and I'm finding it fascinating, but Diggins has a lot to write about that. And in his great book, Up From Communism, I read it in grad school, but I recently reread it, and I learned way more the second time around, and have a great higher estimation of that book the second time around. And I think that, Diggins argues that the Machiavellians represents his sort of turn away from democracy, and that some of this is definitely sort of underwritten by his Marxist sort of hatred for liberalism. At least that seems to be Diggins' argument, and I'm sort of convinced by that. But again, thanks for the great questions, even if I didn't answer them.
Hello. You talked about Marxism being everywhere in American thought and practice. Are there any, or is there a Marxist movement right now, like specifically Marxist, and what does that look like?
Yeah, there sort of is. There are a couple, and I think we'll hear about this tonight, of very popular Marx-inflected journals and magazines and websites that, like Jacobin, that are increasingly popular. The Democratic Socialists for America, which is somewhat of a Marxist-based political party, has seen unprecedented growth since the election. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's more than doubled in its membership. So, but this is all very, very small in sort of the grander American term of things. So I would say yes, but I'd be cautious to say that anything will come of it.
I'm wondering if you have been thinking about the George Fitzhugh as a Marx-influenced thinker in America. he seems to me to be the most significant person to actually bring Marxist concepts to bear in this rather ironic way.
Okay. Well, it is true that Fitzhugh and really anybody who was sort of writing about labor in the middle of the 19th century was using some of the same concepts and terms as Marx was, and that just, to me, speaks to a sort of context. But beyond a context out of which people were understanding issues of labor and capital, and Lincoln really spoke in similar terms as well, but they sort of, Fitzhugh, Lincoln, and Marx were all sort of coming to vastly different conclusions, even if they're talking about the conflict of labor and capital, or just the sort of like use of labor in different ways. So I haven't really thought about Fitzhugh being influenced by Marx, but they're sort of part of the same sort of ethos. But they had very different ideas, I would argue.
A couple of critiques of your talk here. You
Just a couple?
Well, I mean, if you want me to go on an entire dissertation, I can write a 400-page. Okay, so you mentioned that the contradiction. You mentioned that dialectical materialism is a distinctly Marxist-Leninist strain of Marxism, and that contradictions were an imposed form of order
No, it was a philosophical system that allowed Burnham and many others to impose a sort of like logical order on the world.
So the series of contradictions allowed. Well,
The contradictions didn't impose order. The contradictions is something that they were seeing and observing and allowing them to understand the world.
Well, what I'm saying is that that's more of a Hegelian thing of a thesis, antithesis, contradiction to synthesis, and I think that's what Marx was saying in Capital, you know, with the anarchy of production. That's, you know, you have opposing forces acting at the same time within capitalism, and I don't think that's necessarily I think it's an orthodox Marxist concept of dialectical materialism is an orthodox Marxist concept.
Yeah, no, I mean, Marx he theorized capital out of Hegelian concepts of the dialectic, but he never used these terms, and the terms dialectical materialism emerged in the early Soviet Union and became sort of the central thesis of Trotsky in explaining 20th century revolution. But you know, Trotsky read Marx into this theory, and it was there. I think there is a dialectical materialism in Marx that comes from Hegel.
Yeah, Marx talked about turning Hegel on his head. You know, Hegel was a dialectical idealist.
Famously,
yeah.
Yeah.
And the second portion of my critique is that you mainly talk about Marxist-Leninist strains of communism, such as the Trotskyists, but you never really talk about the left communists, or the orthodox communists, such as Amadeo Bordiga or Anton Pannekoek of the 20s, 30s, 40s, who critiqued the Soviet Union before, I think, even many conservatives. Is that just because they don't really, left communists don't really show themselves in America?
Yeah, they're just not very influential, yeah.
And as a response to the lady asking what Marxism in modern America looks like, there's a resurgence of Marxist or interest in Marxist economics, such as Andrew Kleinman at Pace University is doing great work on Marxist economics. Have you heard of Andrew Kleinman?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you
I haven't read much into it.
He's really quite a brilliant economist. I think defends Marxism quite well against many modern critiques.
All right, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
So what I like about this is, so my last book, I wrote a history of the culture wars, and I presented on that research a lot, and everybody has very stark opinions that disagree with me. And this is my first presentation of this research, and it looks like I have years of that to look forward to as well.
Would you care to say something about the absence of class consciousness among the, say, workers in the United States, perhaps compared with their European counterparts?
Yeah, well, there are whole libraries that exist trying to sort of answer that question. And it has informed historians for at least the last 110 years since Werner Sombart asked, why is there no socialism in the United States? And it's one of the central sort of questions of American labor history and other forms of American historiography. And there's like so many reasons given, you know. American workers had access to a lot of meat to eat, unlike European workers, so they were more satisfied. That would be one answer that one historian has given in sort of convincing fashion. The immigrant experience and the frontier create different contexts for thinking about class outside of a European context. The fact that the United States was never a feudal society. So there's a whole range of issues, and I think it's obviously important, and that's why when I talk about Marx in an American context, it's usually as a sort of alter ego or a ghost in the machine. Most Americans don't think that Marx has influenced the way we think about the world, and I'm making this sort of counterintuitive argument that Marx is written into the way we think about the world, even if we don't have the same established class consciousness that European societies do. Bhaskar.
Yeah, so I was curious about Sidney Hook and how you thought his evolution compared or contrast to Burnham, or why you didn't focus on him instead of Burnham, whether, you know, it still fits, or, you know, because Hook kind of had his own, ended up in a similar place. I think was also awarded the Medal of Freedom in '83 by Reagan, but I think had a slightly different trajectory.
Yeah, I spent a week in Hook's papers at the Hoover Institution this fall, and he's a much tougher person to figure out from my vantage point, and I'm still trying to do that, because he was, I would argue, more knowledgeable about Marx and Marxist theory than just about anybody in the 1930s, but turned from but never really got heavily invested in the Trotskyist movement in the 1930s, and sort of turned from it even earlier than Burnham, but never went all the way to the political right, even though during the sort of early Cold War, the McCarthyist era, he made very strong arguments about communist teaching in schools and universities. So he's more of a puzzle, but he did continue to call himself a socialist his entire life. But I don't know if that was more sort of like a posture, because what socialist is voting for Ronald Reagan in 1980? I mean, that's just, I don't know. So he's different, and I haven't pieced it all together yet, and I can't really sort of explain his intellectual trajectory as clear. To me, Burnham comes into focus pretty clearly, and I'm not there on Hook yet. But I think Hook, like Burnham, thought his way out of it. A lot of these sort of turncoats who went from left to right, oftentimes it was rooted in some sort of like they had, it was a personal crisis of some sort, or if they were a member of the Communist Party, it's rooted in the twists and turns of the Soviet Union and positions taken on the Soviet Union was taking relative to things that mattered to them. But for Burnham and Hook, I think they just didn't think that that way of thinking was consistent with what they were seeing in the United States anymore, so it was much more intellectualized.
We're involved in another industrial revolution at the present time, coupled with a recognition pretty widely here in this country, certainly between both parties, of a recognition on the industrial revolution, plus the social economic situation we have with the 1% as against the mass of the rest of the people, and that was referred to just the other, was it last night, on how the incomes in this country has not really moved meaningfully over the last 40 years. So my question is, both parties, right and left, seem to recognize the problem, but both parties are dancing around the answer to the problem of the social economic problem, coupled with the the new industrial revolution, which is going to end up with masses of people not having jobs because your faculties, your schools, your white-collar jobs, a great many of them are going to be obsoleted over the next 5 to 10 years. What do you see, based upon your knowledge of Mr. Marx, as to was Bernie Sanders, 4 years, 8 years too soon?
Yeah, good question. So now you're asking me to be a prophet, and that's where I'm on shaky grounds. Well, in many ways, Marx still speaks to this issue, even though he was writing at the early end of the last major industrial revolution. Because when he talks about factory production and its role in capitalism, he's not necessarily talking about how we imagine sort of 19th century factories with smokestacks. He's talking about it as a system of disciplining and controlling labor and getting as much production out of labor for as least cost as possible in controlling labor. So it's a political and an economic argument. And that's really part of the sort of intellectual logic of our new industrial revolution with automation. That is going to put, as you say, many, many people out of work. But I can't really predict the future, except that I think there's going to be a lot of political turmoil, and 2016 is just the beginning. So there's a little optimism. Uh-oh.
Hey, Andrew. Good talk. My question is about the American political tradition. There's been lots of conversation in the last 20 years about the character and shape of the American political tradition, really, I guess, 50 years. And I think that you agree with Louis Hartz that liberalism is the center of the American political tradition, not civic republicanism, as Gordon Wood and Bernard Bailyn have said, or not ascriptive illiberalism, as Roger Smith has said. And so I wonder, how does recognizing the influence of Karl Marx and Marxist styles of thinking, or Marxoid kind of thought, how does that change our understanding of the American political tradition?
Good question. I think you're right that I agree with Louis Hartz, at least in description, not prescription, because he liked the liberal tradition a little more than I do. Although he was sort of uncomfortable with it as well. And liberalism, really, I would argue, has been, in this sort of like classic sense, the only game in town. And so those sort of political ideas that emerge in the United States have to emerge in some fashion in opposition to it. And I think that's where Marx has provided. I would argue that the American left starts with socialists in the late 19th century adopting the ideas of Marxism, because it was for them the best answer to this liberalism, especially in terms of thinking about labor, the labor question in relation to capitalism, in relation to the political establishment. So I agree with Hartz, and I think that allows us to better think through alternative political traditions that I think almost always seem to arise against the liberal tradition. But, there's a lot of people who would disagree with that characterization, probably you included. Hurry, Paul.
I want to keep you waiting. So I'm curious about your title, Ghost in the Machine, which I take to mean that Marx appears in American intellectual life at one remove, that he shapes thinkers who write influential work with sort of Marxism submerged somehow, or the logic is there, but the name isn't. Is that how he's a ghost in the machine? I don't really want to challenge that, I'm not sure. But how significant then is that in terms of like understanding Marx in America, if he's sort of like a ghost-like presence that can be compared to probably any number of influential Western intellectuals?
Okay. That's a good challenging question. So I think to some degree, the reason I think about this is because I've been looking at these moments in American history when Marx seems to reemerge, and I pointed to the 30s, the 60s, and recently. And there have been a whole series of, so just talking about recently, there have been a whole series of essays that have appeared in the New Yorker, and the New York Times even, and like, why is Marx returning? What is this? And these essays are always devoid of any historical understanding of it. And so to me, the sort of metaphor of the ghost in the machine is that sometimes the ghost in the machine's always there, but sometimes comes to haunt like a specter. And I mean, I guess I'm trying to make the case that Marx is more important than a lot of these other thinkers because ultimately I think that capitalism is extremely important in understanding that the world that capitalism has made for us is extremely important. And to me, whether you agree or disagree with Marx's sort of analysis and diagnosis of capitalism, he speaks to those terms, and the terms of the debate keep returning precisely because the questions of capital and labor have not gone away and will not go away. And he gave us sort of the words and the way of understanding that, and that's so important. So that's why I see Marx as ultimately very significant. And I don't want to compare Marx in terms of the influence to, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson or something, but that's why he continues, his texts continue to sort of act as this alter ego.
Hi, I come to this conversation a little bit differently. I'm here as a public historian and a student of political rhetoric. And so I'm curious as to, you've made a convincing case to me that Marx is, in fact, this ghost in the machine, so I'm not going to debate you on that. If that's true, is there utility in that for the polarization debate that we've been talking about since last evening? Is he's a much more weighted name, I think, for the typical American political citizen than Thomas Jefferson or someone like that. So if your argument is correct, is there utility in introducing him back into the polarization debate?
Yeah, reintroducing Marx is not going to make us less polarized, if that's what you're asking. In fact, quite the opposite. But I would argue that one of the reasons why we're so polarized is because of economic polarization, and the way in which that manifests politically doesn't always obviously doesn't map on exactly to the economic polarization. And in that way, like if you're like sort of, if you want to think in these in sort of like these strictly philosophical rational terms, the political polarization oftentimes seems irrational. I don't argue that. But maybe bringing Marx into it helps people make sense of polarization. That would be my argument. But I don't think most people would agree with me, and I don't think by making that argument I'm going to make things less polarized. I think polarization is here to stay for a while. But I like this little Platonic bubble we've created in this room where we're not polarized. Thanks for your questions.